Thank you very much, Matt, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm delighted to be in a position to address you today, and hope maybe the next time that we have a follow-up that I'll be able to get up there in person. What I want to talk about today are four critical dynamics that, when taken together, I think present both the dangers and opportunities and the complexities of the present international situation. I want to take each of these critical features separately, and then I think it'll be clear when I get to the end of my remarks and discuss some of the immediate solutions that are available, that it should provoke a rather lively discussion afterwards. I want to start with the fact that right now the entire global financial system, particularly centered in the transatlantic region, Western Europe and the United States, is on the verge of what will perhaps be the greatest financial crash of the last 100 years or more, perhaps the greatest financial crash in modern history. What has been going on increasingly since the breakup of the original Bretton Woods system, which occurred in 1971, is that all of the dynamics within the transatlantic region, and by that I also mean to include Africa and the countries of South and Central America and the Caribbean, the dynamic has been tilted very much in favor of financial speculation, debt as an instrument of looting and destruction of national sovereignty, and in many cases, the debt has been used as a means of creating the conditions for outright population genocide. Now, many of you are familiar with the fact that in the period of 2007 and 2008, you had a major financial blowout in the United States. It was followed a year or two later by similar developments in Europe, and in both instances, first through the U.S. Federal Reserve and Treasury, and later through the European Central Bank, the policy has been to save the financial institutions, preserve a mountain of unpayable and, in many cases, illegitimate debt at the expense of the living conditions of the population of these nations. In both Europe and in the United States, particularly in the Mediterranean region of Europe, and in virtually every major urban center in the United States, there has been an appreciable collapse in the conditions of life in order to bail out bankrupt financial institutions and preserve the political power of Wall Street, the City of London, and the other major international financial capitals. Take the case of Spain in Europe, where youth unemployment has crossed well beyond 50%. And this is even after many young people, particularly people with university degrees, have left the country and gone to other parts of Europe where the job prospects are a little bit better. What's happening in Europe and the United States right now is something that is very familiar to the nations of Africa, of South America, parts of Asia, where this policy of IMF conditionalities, World Bank restrictions on real lending for development have already, for many decades, produced worsening and worsening conditions of life for more and more of the populations of these countries. And you've had increasingly the phenomenon where the controls exerted over governmental policy decisions in the economic and financial realm have pretty much stripped many countries of any pretense even of retaining true national sovereignty. Now, what's going on at this point in Europe and in the United States is that the policy of zero interest rate lending by the central banks has created an even bigger financial bubble than the bubble that blew in 2008 September, when ostensibly it was the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers that triggered a whole crisis. The policies that have been pursued to try to deal with that crisis have actually, in fact, perpetuated and made it worse. The Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank for all of the world's central banks, put out its annual report a month ago and basically said that we are on the edge of the biggest financial blowout in modern history, and that basically the debt bubble, particularly associated with the out-of-control expansion of derivatives speculation, is unsustainable and will blow up at some point very soon unless there is an orderly bankruptcy reorganization process. Of course, the BIS being the BIS, they also demand massive austerity measures so that the pound of flesh is taken from the populations of the countries on their target list. So this dynamic is something that's playing out very rapidly. Some of you may have taken notice of the fact that the largest bank in Portugal is basically going through a process of bankruptcy collapse over the last several days. Yesterday, the stock in what's called Banco Espírito Santo collapsed in one day by 50%. Risk premiums on the bank's bonds have gone up in one day by 9% to now about 24% yields on bank-issued bonds. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So the crises that ravaged Asia and Africa and South America in the late 1990s has now fully come home to roost and is hitting extremely hard right now in Europe and in the United States. So that dynamic is moving forward, and one can expect that sometime, perhaps over the course of this summer, perhaps into the early fall, but at some point, for sure, very, very soon, we're going to be facing a break point in the entire system. This is a system that Mr. LaRouche has characterized as oligarchical monetarist finance, a system associated with the key principles of empire. In the current state of play, we're talking about an Anglo-Dutch empire which exerts enormous influence over the United States through its Wall Street operations. Now, the second dynamic, which is of equally grave danger, is the move towards war. And you have, as many of you in this room are undoubtedly aware, there are wars going on virtually everywhere around the globe, either big wars or wars that are basically simmering crises that could erupt out of control at any moment. The impulse on the part of the British, on the part of the current administration in the United States, on the part of the hardcore of this transatlantic imperial faction is to divert attention away from the financial crisis by provoking further wars and conflicts. In the case of Russia and China, there is an intensive drive to demonize the current Russian government and an only slightly less extreme effort to demonize the current government in China. There is a new form of warfare that's underway in many parts of the planet, which has been described recently at an international security conference in Moscow as a form of asymmetric warfare called the color revolutions, referring to the current and ongoing destabilization in Ukraine, where through various government and non-government agencies, the European Union and the Obama administration have conducted a major destabilization. Remember that the Yanukovych government, which was overthrown in February, was a legally elected government. It was to have served for more than another year in power, but by foreign-financed demonstrations, including the involvement of armed paramilitary groupings, you had an overthrow of a government. You could call it a paramilitary coup that took place. And this is not the first and will probably not be the last of these kinds of color revolutions, which have created the conditions of major instability. And the Russians have made clear that they understand perfectly well that these color revolutions are part of a coherent strategy of regime change, ultimately directed against Russia. The government of China is convinced that there are similar efforts underway to undermine the role of China. The situation in Ukraine has reached such a danger point, particularly following the crash of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, that this week a group of leading former European diplomats from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, working through an organization called the European Leadership Network, issued a dire warning that there's a very real danger of a major confrontation erupting involving the major thermonuclear weapon-armed nations of this planet, i.e. the United States, Britain, Russia, China. So the danger of war, a big war, is looming very large. Many have noted that we have now reached the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. You had the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in June of 1914. You had Austro-Hungarian declaration of war against Serbia 100 years ago last week. And we're now into the period 100 years ago that was historically referred to as the Guns of August. So in Europe and in the United States in particular, August is normally thought of as a very quiet period. In Europe, the entire continent virtually shuts down for the month of August, but it's under those kinds of moments that the greatest danger can emerge of a crisis breaking out of control. You have the situation ongoing in the Middle East with the Israeli invasion of Gaza. The United Nations has openly said that the actions on the part of the Israeli military constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is a policy of collective guilt and collective punishment being imposed on the 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza. The United States, Britain, France, and other countries, including Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, have been so committed to the overthrow of the Assad government in Syria that they've unleashed a jihadist apparatus that is now threatening the survival of many nations of the Middle East. And there's a growing danger that we could find ourselves facing a 100 years religious war within the Islamic world between Sunni and Shia. So these war dangers are grave, and they are a direct outgrowth and byproduct of the fact that the entire existing dominant global financial system is facing an existential crisis. Many people are not aware of it, but the worst financial collapse of the 20th century did not happen between 1929 and 1931. It happened in June and July of 1914, when there were bank collapses, runs on currency, and other economic disasters that hit simultaneously in 50 countries around the world, including very much so in Western Europe. And the correlation between these kinds of cataclysmic financial collapses and the outbreak of general war is a critical factor to consider in terms of where the present global situation stands. Now, there is a very healthy response to this crisis, and this is critically the third dynamic that I want to address in these opening remarks. For a very long time, Lyndon LaRouche has been known internationally for promoting the urgent need to establish a new and more just world economic order. In 1975, Mr. LaRouche was invited to Iraq to attend an anniversary conference of the Ba'ath Party. It was just on the eve of the outbreak of the Lebanon war. And in those discussions, he basically put forward the idea that the significant expansion of oil revenue coming into the Persian Gulf region following the oil shock of a couple of years before that indicated that there was the potential to create a new development bank that could be capitalized by investment of Middle East money, other money from the U.S. and Europe, that would be outside of the controls of the IMF and the World Bank, and would be dedicated to issuing long-term, low-interest credits for earmarked development projects, particularly in those areas of the world, such as Africa, South America, parts of Asia, that were so desperately in need of economic development. That idea for an international development bank has been kicking around for a very long time. In the early 1980s, Mr. LaRouche was asked by the then president of Mexico, Jose Lopez Portillo, to put together an economic plan for how Mexico could deal with a tremendous debt crisis. And Mr. LaRouche basically identified the fact that much of Mexico's debt was not legitimate, but was part of this system of debt looting. And he wrote a paper called Operation Juarez that called for the establishment of a cartel of nations that would fight back against the impossibility of paying these unjust debts. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s into the early 1990s, and the so-called Churchill Iron Curtain came down, Mr. LaRouche and his wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche, proposed that there should be a concerted effort on the part of all of the nations of Eurasia to revive the old Silk Road, to build out what he referred to at the time as a Eurasian land bridge, to build up development corridors that would link the Asia-Pacific region of the Far East to the westernmost points of Western Europe through an integrated system of high-speed rail development corridors, and that these would in turn link through the Middle East down into similar development projects in Africa. And there were similar projects for integrating the economic situation in South, Central, and North America. In other words, a global system of real economic development based on the most advanced scientific and technological principles, including a massive expansion of nuclear power as the energy source, while we worked on the transition to a global effort to achieve a breakthrough on thermonuclear fusion, which is the cheap, safe energy source for the coming centuries. Now, these ideas have been debated and discussed and reviewed in literally hundreds of policy papers, international conferences. In the last 2 years, the Schiller Institute has sponsored almost a dozen conferences in North America and in Europe on the theme of the urgent need for a new strategic paradigm of thinking to basically create the conditions for a viable and bright future. Now, 3 weeks ago, at the third annual meeting of the BRICS organization, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The meeting took place in Brazil, and at that meeting, an agreement was reached, not only among the BRICS members countries, but involving virtually all of the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean as well, to establish what they called a new development bank. They also established a $100 billion currency stabilization reserve in order to allow all of the member countries of the BRICS and other countries presumably that will ally with this effort to defend themselves collectively against the piracy and looting of the vulture funds and hedge funds and currency speculators that have ruined many nations in the developing world simply on the basis of greed and the opportunity to destroy their currencies, their markets, in order to loot what exists of their physical economies. We see this fight playing out right now in the case of Argentina. Argentina is under attack by a group of what are called, quite aptly, vulture funds, who purchased Argentine sovereign debt on the secondary market for, on average, 2 to 3 cents on the dollar, and are now attempting to collect through court actions in a corrupt federal court in New York on the full face value of that debt. In other words, they're seeking to make multi-1,000% profits, even though Argentina has successfully renegotiated with bondholders a restructuring of their debt that covers 96% of the entire Argentine debt. Well, Argentina is resisting, and coming out of the BRICS meeting, a number of the leading countries within the BRICS have made clear that they intend to basically establish new cooperative trading relationships that will be done in local currencies. Recently, during President Putin's visit to China, he and Chinese President Xi Jinping signed a 30-year, more than $400 billion natural gas deal. And that entire project will be paid and denominated in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan. There are the seeds here of creating the mechanisms for international trade on a multilateral basis outside of the blackmail framework of the U.S. dollar, the IMF, the SWIFT system, and the New York clearinghouse banks. What this would mean is that the ability of the U.S. and the European Union to use economic sanctions as another form of asymmetric warfare against targeted countries would come to an end on the basis that a new system, an alternative system, is being put in place. Now, the Chinese government, since Xi Jinping first came into power a little bit over a year ago, has made it clear that they are committed to investing in the building of this new Silk Road, linking China and the Far East all the way across the European continent into the major ports on the Atlantic and Mediterranean and Aegean coasts of Europe. There are developed plans for similar investment in major projects in Africa, where there is an urgent need for major water management projects, for high-speed rail, for nuclear power, to unleash the vast potentialities of the African continent. During Xi Jinping's visit in South America to attend the BRICS meeting, he also met separately with heads of state of the countries of South America, and in those meetings, there were detailed plans worked out for one of the major projects of this new development bank to be the building of a transcontinental high-speed rail system to service all of South America. There have been discussions between key people in Russia, China, and the United States about the need to build an extension of the Trans-Siberian Railroad up to the Bering Straits and the building of rail tunnels underneath the Bering Straits that would establish, for the first time ever, a land route linking all of Eurasia and Africa to the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. These are projects that will take decades to complete, but nevertheless, there is a commitment not only to launching these projects, but to establishing the alternative financial mechanisms by which those projects can be financed on the basis of directed state credit issued at low interest rates on a long-term basis to build these vital infrastructure programs on a global scale. So what happened in Brazil at the BRICS meeting has shaken the very foundations of London and Wall Street. And in fact, this is one of the reasons precisely why we are seeing this accelerated and vicious campaign of demonization of Russia and of President Putin, and why it is that the danger of war is so pronounced. What's really at stake is the fact that this entire long-standing system of a financial oligarchy lording over and dominating the affairs of nation-states is coming to an end. And the seeds have been planted with the BRICS meeting in Argentina for a new system. In fact, a new system based on old principles. What's being proposed in the BRICS summit with the creation of this new development bank and the defense fund against speculative assaults against sovereign currencies is exactly what the policy was of President Franklin Roosevelt when he oversaw the Bretton Woods Conference, where a post-war system of fixed exchange rates among currencies was established with the intention of using the post-war period to end the threat of war by going into massive development in places like Africa. Roosevelt, unfortunately, died less than a year after the signing of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the government that came in upon his death of President Harry Truman abandoned virtually all of the development plans that were so pivotal to Roosevelt. So what we're talking about with the BRICS is, in a very direct way, an attempt to go back, to turn the clock back to a vision of a world collaborating on development that was at the heart of President Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to create the Bretton Woods system and to move beyond what happened at the end of World War I with the Versailles Agreements that virtually guaranteed that there would be another world war within a generation. Now, the final element of this picture that I want to just present very briefly is that you should expect to see some dramatic changes in the United States. And the general directionality of those changes is towards the United States embracing and allying with the ideas that came out of the BRICS summit meeting last month in Brazil. In other words, a United States returning to its historic roots, which was a nation that established a constitution that had grown out of a revolution against the most powerful empire on the planet at that time, namely the British Empire. We had the history of our establishment under Alexander Hamilton's direction as Treasury Secretary of a national bank that was a true development bank that invested in, at that time, roads, canals, the development of the first industrial cities in the United States, Paterson, New Jersey, which was built because of an enormous access to hydroelectric power through waterfalls. So we had the tradition under President Abraham Lincoln of the greenbacks, which were a federal currency that was based on the constitutional principles of credit, and that was not only pivotal to winning the Civil War, but it was pivotal to the immediate construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which became a model of development that was emulated all over the world in the subsequent decades, with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, with Sun Yat-sen's plans for a massive rail infrastructure development in China, the Meiji Restoration period in Japan. There were plans for effectively building a land bridge policy 100 years ago or more that were scotched when the empire basically promoted a series of wars to prevent that realization from fully happening. We're heading in the United States to a very profound moment of crisis where the population realizes that the core principles of the United States have been abandoned and have been replaced by an alternative set of principles dictated from London and Wall Street, and that the American people are suffering under this, and they've just about reached the point where they've had enough. Last week in the U.S. Congress, which has been paralyzed by partisanship for the better part of the last decade, particularly since the 9/11 attacks back on September 11th, 2001, you had for the first time a truly bipartisan assertion of the authority of Congress when 370 members of the House of Representatives from both the Democratic and Republican Party, that's an overwhelming majority, voted that on a resolution that basically told the President of the United States that he cannot go to war in Iraq without first coming to Congress and presenting the case and getting congressional approval. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution makes it very clear that only Congress has the authority to declare war. Once a war is declared, the President is the commander-in-chief, but it's Congress that has the authority to make that decision, and it's Congress that also controls the purse strings. Founding fathers created this system of checks and balances because they knew that the greatest danger from a tyranny or from an emperor was the unilateral ability to declare war and use it as a means of domestic control as well as foreign expansionism. The American founders were passionately anti-empire, and therefore they gave Congress the sole authority to approve of war and to finance it, knowing that Congress would be the most unruly and most broadly representative body of government. So we're seeing the beginning of a dramatic shift in the United States back to tradition and back to the core principles on which the country was founded. There are 4 bills before the U.S. Congress right now, 2 in the House and 2 in the Senate, to reinstate Glass-Steagall, which was the 1933 law that broke up the power of Wall Street and established a total separation between commercial banks and speculative investment banking. That law is before both houses of Congress. This administration, which is very much under the total domination of Wall Street, is opposed to it, but they've just suffered a tremendous bloody nose on the issue of the president's claim that as commander-in-chief he has the authority to bring the nation to war, which is absolutely not the case. Now, with all of these developments playing out, Mr. LaRouche this week has issued a call for a global dialogue. Basically, we're at the point now where the existing financial and monetary system is doomed and it urgently needs to be replaced. We need a system that's based on something other than arbitrary valuation of money. We need a system among nations in which currencies are valued, in which economies are judged on the basis of principles of productivity and physical economy. And there has to be a recognition that cooperation for development of all of the nations of the world, cooperation on advanced projects in science, including significant effort to deal with the challenges posed by space, challenges related to the question of, at long last, completing the research on thermonuclear fusion. These kinds of things require serious discussion among leading figures among all the nations of the world. And it's far better to sit down on formal and informal bases and start talking about some of the really challenging questions of the real economy. How do you define productivity? What's the most effective way to invest in a way that expands economic potentiality for the future for all nations and is not a system that is horribly skewed in favor of a small select group of nations at the expense of all others? So this idea of launching this kind of discussion at a moment when not only the threat of war and financial collapse is at its greatest, but also at a moment that the seeds have already been firmly planted for a new and far more just system that can benefit all the nations of this planet, looking into the next generation and subsequent generations after that. Man is unique. Man, among all living species, has the ability to think creatively, to make scientific discoveries, to literally alter the nature of the future. And so the challenge is to actually rise to the challenge of that kind of nature of man and move forward into the future on the basis of cooperation among the leading nations of the world for development rather than looting and warfare, which has been the dominant factor for, unfortunately, the better part of the last 40, 50 years. So let me leave it right there